Bicycling on Mars, Thoughts on the Future of Transportation. This is delivered for Catedral Max Arb, UNAM, Mexico City. And it's about this problem, which even before the current crises around the pandemic, but also the climate crisis, shows us that we can't really think about how we're going to get around the planet when faced by scenes like this, which of course, as you might recognize, is Los Angeles in the United States. So to go to our first sort of way of looking for solutions, we're going to go to Bangalore, India, where we're going to think about sort of low-tech solutions, to thinking in a different way, in a more bottom-up way, about how we get around the planet. So this lecture is actually inspired by the Indian artist Sudipto Dasgupta, who died last year. And he was a teacher at Srishti Institute in Bangalore in India, where I've worked as a lecturer quite a lot and have started the Future of Transportation project, which continues as a series of lectures, projects such as one we did at Srishti in Bangalore with undergraduates last year, but also continues as a very active Facebook group called Future of Transportation, with about 10 or 11 posts a day from all over the world, with people coming up with ideas for the future of transportation, which are less obvious than most. So this is one of the works by Sudipto Dasgupta, where he makes these kind of impossible velocipedes that can also be used by children. And but he also introduced me to this idea of the Indian basic bicycle, which I suppose is an interesting symbol for the problems facing India. So going back to Bangalore, where people in the same city often only communicate by Zoom or Skype, because it can take 5 hours to battle the traffic from one suburb to another. And it was in this ruinously congested city that the concept of a project about the future of transportation was developed. Going back to this previous image, I think I want to talk about this sari-clad young woman with flowing hair and scarf, with the mischievous expression, on a skateboard hanging on to a bicycle rickshaw, hitching a free ride. So this image, which is subversive in many ways, both in gender politics and expectations, symbolizes the free thinking and bottom-up playful attitude towards these very pressing problems. So how do we traverse the planet sustainably, efficiently, and without causing endless congestion? So I rode one of these bicycles around Bangalore, but the interesting thing about where this bicycle is actually parked is it's actually by a railway station, which is very, very close to the new Bangalore International Airport. Yet there was no thought of using the train line to get people out to the airport. Instead, they built a superhighway. So I want to continue with this idea of the Indian basic. Here we can see this boy is like carrying a sack of corn on the back, and they used all over India. So to introduce the project to the students at Srishti, these were all undergraduates, myself and Sudipto Dasgupta organized our first session on the future of transportation actually on a train. So we took the students on this local train, which took you out to the edge of Bangalore. And the idea was that this train, it wasn't crowded like many Indian trains, because the suburban trains in Bangalore are not very well used. So it was actually almost empty. And we were able to use this train as a traveling classroom in order to get the students to think about how traveling could be redefined in another way. So it was kind of what I asked them to do was to get on the train with a notebook and make drawings. They weren't allowed to use their mobile phones or cameras. And they had to actually imagine the interior of the train as a kind of an exoplanet, similar to landing on another planet, to literally think about that train as a different environment. And interestingly, after we did this future transportation session, Dasgupta got involved in a local group which was actually demonstrating. Here you see them demonstrating on the station in Bangalore, to actually reuse these suburban trains to do something about the congestion. And another group of students at Bangalore decided to follow the Reclaim the Streets movement in the UK. And what they did, this group of students managed to organize, and this is really no mean feat in India, to actually close off the streets around the art college, that is Srishti, and to turn the streets back into a humanized place. And here we see one of the teachers at Srishti, so with some of the students literally playing a game on the streets. Another group in the future transportation decided to set up a kind of fake bureau for collecting stories about commuters called Sayahana. So here we see one of the identity cards which the students use, and literally they went out into the into this is the name of the leader of this course was the Indian artist Suresh Kumar, and they literally had these fake cards and literally went to bus terminals and collected stories about people's commuting days. And this is another project where there was this abandoned car outside the college, and you can see the street has been cleared of cars except this one car which had been sitting there for over a year, and they'd literally decided to these kids, local kids who were totally interested in this idea, decided to decorate these this car with these wedding garlands which I provided them with. And this is me on the bike, and it's part of a project basically about time banking, where people could literally earn credits time banking by riding a stationary bicycle. And one of the credits they could get was a subway, free ticket to the Bangalore metro system, but also they could also get a ride on the back of this bike that I was riding around. So this also went to the Cochin Biennale, where we actually set up a department of the future of transportation. Here we see also an auto rickshaw, a tuk-tuk. We'll talk more about tuk-tuks later because they're very significant. In this case was adapted by the French artist Thomas Las Bouilles to take people around the city with GPS and Wi-Fi. So this is the group Hey Hey, moving on from India. They like to use humor, but they basically, I think they basically summarized the kind of playful attitudes that we're suggesting that artists might like to have. I just want to refer to the title that Bicycling on Mars, as a way for describing the ambiguous enigma of small subversive actions applied to massive transport infrastructures. So before I use this title for this series of lectures, I thought I'd better check Google first. In fact, there are a number of discussions about how mountain bikes would in fact be a very effective way of exploring the red planet if we have developed effective and flexible spacesuits for riding them by the time we got there. So just arguing here that small subversive and playful actions by artists, DIY activists and others in the field of transportation can gently nudge and challenge big transport infrastructures towards alternatives and sustainability. And here we see Heiko Hansen of the French group Hey Hey as part of the Istanbul Biennale with his one-person electric-powered train, literally taking the tram lines that run right the way through through Istanbul. So they are very, very interested in their projects with the book Aramis, or the Love of Technology, by the philosopher Bruno Latour. It's a discursive drama about the rise and fall of the personal rapid transport system in France, which would have been an automated system where trains replaced cars in the Paris suburbs, and commuters would couple up individual rail vehicles to make a longer train. As Latour refers to it, it was a technology sufficiently magnificent and spiritual to convince them that the machines by which they're surrounded are cultural artifacts surrounded by power. In other words, the project was fueled initially by institutional belief. For Latour, this story was a way to study sociologically the various actors in the drama, the engineers, the RATP, that's the organization that runs the French metro, the Paris metro rather, the French government, and observe their interplay. But for some artists, the fact that this enlightened and futuristic project was abandoned and so completely buried in the annals of technological history was enough to try to create the artistic belief to build some of these vehicles. So, quoting Helen Evans, so what we're seeing here, I'll give you the quote in a moment, is a personal rail vehicle that's created by the group Hey Hey, actually on an abandoned railway track that goes around France called the Petit Sentier. So Helen Evans talks about the Aramis project. Despite all of the high-level investment and top technologists, the ongoing theme is that no one loved it enough for it to succeed. There's not enough belief. We are activating this unloved technological concept by using very similar technology. And the other member of the group, Heiko Hansen, who you saw on the flight on the magic carpet, saying it was also meant as a comment on the history of personal rail travel itself, post-moon landing technology challenged. As Nixon said, if we could send 3 men to the moon 20,000 miles, 200,000 miles away, we should be able to move 200,000 people to work 3 miles away. So Hey Hey combine, as I've said, a playful and mischievous and subversive approach to innovative DIY art making. And inspired by Aramis, they've devised their own site-specific personal rail systems around the world, which includes tapis volant, which is the one, flying carpet, which is the one you saw in Istanbul, the H line in New York, and a metronome, which we're seeing here. Each of them have a logo based on the actual logo of the metro system in the cities that they have. An emblem on the first passenger railway from Liverpool to Manchester. And so we'll see, that's me actually driving the metronome in Paris. This is their idea also. They had the idea of actually creating a network of artists who are building rail vehicles, and we're going to see other artists who build rail vehicles in this presentation. And this is the emblem. I'm going to just show you, this is basically done in Manchester, and you can see that the logo here is the Manchester, England, that is, and it's on the Manchester to Liverpool railway line, which is the first railway line in the world. And the idea here was that you could go to a station and members of the public could buy a ticket and then drive the train themselves. that gave you a sense of how Emblem worked. This is another project by them, which was developed as part of the exhibition Exoplanet Lot, which was done here in Southwest France, which is where I'm speaking from. Was the Centipede project, which was the idea of a rail vehicle that you could cycle. And the Centipede ran between two towns, which were separated by about 14 kilometers. And the idea was that it should be a user-friendly, low-tech method of transportation. And this is the final version of the Centipede that was produced by Hey. This is another project by Hey, showing this kind of mixture of technologies. So the thing about Centipede, going back to it, it merges a futuristic artistic vision with rural regeneration. So this autonomous multi-driver vehicle might one day travel both on road and rail sustainably. So both Aramis and Hey's vision undercut today's obsession with self-driving cars, in which roads will become narrower and traffic signals will vanish as autonomous cars, shuttles and buses blend and interweave in a delicate syncopated ballet of technological harmony. Hey almost seemed to predict the future in their earlier dystopic toy emissions, which featured a miniature SUV emitting dramatic poisonous smoke, dodging the wheels of trucks and cars in New York City. We don't have an illustration of that. And this is another final project that they did recently, which is a project about water. It's actually a floating project which analyzes water in the River Rhone in France. And this finally is a project by them, a much earlier project, but I think it relates to our thinking about climate, which is called Nuage Vert, or Green Cloud, which they did here, pictured in Helsinki, where they had a laser projection with feedback on the emissions from this coal-fired power station in Helsinki. And as consumers in Helsinki switched on their appliances in the evening, the shape of the projection would change. So moving on to Mexico, this isn't Mexico, this is White Sands Desert in New Mexico. I went to visit this group called CEFT, which is created by Mexican artists Ivan Puig and Andres Padilla Domini. So I went to meet them in the United States, actually, but they'd actually crossed the Mexican border in this vehicle, so we can see me with it. And then we drove up to Albuquerque. And that's it, leaving the museum, the art museum in Mexico City. So this is a back to the future style retro futurist vehicle that was created by engineers and sort of backyard engineers in Mexico City. And so the CEFT-1 set out on a 1,000-mile journey to explore the abandoned railway lines of Mexico, to collect stories and discover the damage done by the overnight privatization of the Mexican railway system, when all passenger services were halted in the name of profit back in the 90s. And between 2006 and 2001, the artists traveled across Mexico and Ecuador in the CEFT-1. In this transdisciplinary art project, their explorations became a starting point for reflection and research, recording the landscapes and infrastructures around and between cities, interviewing people they met, often from communities isolated. And they shared their findings, isolated by the railway closures. And, you know, we're going to watch the film in a minute, but they talk here about modern ruins and how in the second half of the 19th century, the Mexican government partnered with British government companies to build the railway line that would connect Mexico City with the Atlantic Ocean and beyond to Europe. So you can see some images from this. So this is actually quite interesting because it was basically there was a very famous 19th century painting of this viaduct, which actually caused outrage in Mexico because it was the first sort of modern intrusion in a painting, and so they found it very necessary to find this bridge and drive the Seft over it. This is the Seft in one of the red deserts, and these are the people they met on the way, and this is the interior of the cockpit. It's the Seft moving along and finally arriving in Marte, Mars.
En México se privatizó el Sistema Nacional de Ferrocarriles en 1995. Con ello se canceló el servicio de pasajeros porque no era negocio. Quedaron cerca de 9.000 kilómetros de vías de tren en desuso y muchas poblaciones incomunicadas. Tenemos menos vías que hace 100 años.
Decidimos investigar de cerca qué estaba pasando en los espacios ferroviarios abandonados. ¿A dónde llevarían todos estos caminos? Necesitábamos un vehículo que sirviera para transportarnos con todas nuestras preguntas por las vías. Fabricamos una nave espacial, un dispositivo de investigación para emprender una exploración hacia el espacio interior del país.
Su diseño retoma la idea de futuro que se tenía en el pasado y hace una paráfrasis de las exploraciones espaciales. La sonda de exploración ferroviaria tripulada tiene fuselaje de aluminio y está equipada con tecnologías de ubicación espaciotemporal que fusionan lo análogo y lo digital.
A bordo de la Seft-1, mi hermano y yo exploramos durante un año vías de tren abandonadas por todo el territorio mexicano. Ahí comíamos y dormíamos, nos convertimos en ferronautas. Hicimos el ejercicio de retransitar los caminos por los que el ferrocarril solía pasar propagando la promesa del futuro.
La Seft-1 está equipada con un sistema high rail que le permite viajar sobre las vías. En muchas ocasiones no encontramos ni rieles ni durmientes, ya que estos espacios han sido saqueados ambiciosamente. Sin embargo, la nave puede desplazarse por cualquier camino.
Al explorar, generamos fotografías, videos, audios y textos de nuestros encuentros. Recopilamos testimonios de las personas que siguen habitando esos espacios, sus historias y denuncias. Recolectamos lo que llamamos muestras lunares, que son fragmentos de una arqueología postcatástrofe. Cada día transmitíamos parte de todo este material al sitio web del proyecto.
El sitio web es el archivo documental del proyecto. Ahí es posible revisar las rutas realizadas y su trazo en mapas, ver fotos y videos, así como leer reflexiones críticas y anécdotas. También está disponible información histórica provista por un equipo de investigación.
En algunas poblaciones por las que pasamos, mostramos los encuentros que habíamos tenido en otros lugares. De esta manera la sonda funcionaba como un transbordador de historias y preguntas. Nos cuestionamos la noción de progreso asociada al futuro. El paso de la sonda por estos lugares evidenciaba el desmoronamiento del metarrelato moderno que predica la relación positiva entre el progreso y el bienestar social. Recorrimos y contemplamos una gran cantidad de ruinas ferroviarias. Eran construcciones sorprendentemente recientes. Estábamos viajando por ruinas modernas. Investigando los esquemas de dependencia tecnológica, atestiguamos dos polos de la experiencia social de la tecnología, la utilidad y el desecho.
Seft-1 ha generado una serie de fuertes resonancias en la sociedad que han reactivado la discusión en torno a estos temas y ha servido para catalizar otros proyectos, participando desde el arte como un transformador social tangible.
So I'm going to go on from Seft now to talk about the other Mexican artist in this here, which is Tania Candiani. So she was inspired by this French locksmith, Besnier, who tried to literally fly with this flying machine. And she's very interested in sort of retooling obsolete notions of technologies and thinking about her father was an engineer, and she used the inspiration of her father to think about how these lost technologies could be revitalized. But firstly, we should show her in fairly modern technology, which is the project organized by Nahum Mantra, the Mexican artist, of the first Mexican zero gravity plane in this Ilyushin MDK-76 plane, which is a diving aircraft, in which you can float. It's used for training astronauts. I actually flew in this plane myself in 1999, and then went on with the art and science group, the Arts Catalyst, to curate over 50 projects in this diving aircraft. It's a parabolic flight, which means that it literally climbs like that, and then you have about 30 to 40 seconds of zero gravity, and then it finally dives, and it goes back, starts with double gravity, and then ends with double gravity. It's kind of a little crazy to imagine the notion of having a large airliner dive to achieve zero gravity. Now we're really questioning the emissions from aircraft in the targets being set by the Paris Agreement. We'll talk about that a little later. But in the earlier on in the last decade, it seemed quite an interesting idea. So Tania was inspired by this 19th century competition in Lyon and Paris to devise new forms of hot air balloon travel. So this is an engraving from one of those competitions. But she took part in an exhibition that I curated here in France. So she came over to France to do this project, which is basically based on a fantasy that she could literally float herself in this basket, this floating basket, flying basket. And we actually enacted this project in a rather beautiful pond outside this villa in southwest France. And she is also did a project as part of the future of transportation, where she was inspired by this sort of Indian idea of the Vimana, these flying deities that apparently had some kind of engineering background to them. And so when she came to take part in the future of transportation at Srishti, we went with a group of undergraduate students to do a large project for the Kochi Biennale, which is a fairly major world biennale in Cochin in Kerala, India. And she built this flying object, which the students all built. You can see underneath in the background the other project that I referred to earlier, the Department of the Future of Transportation, which was this fictive office environment. And then I did another exhibition called No Such Thing as Gravity in Taiwan, which also had an artisanal mantra in it. And Tania came and flew a kind of Chinese version of this UFO-like Vimana as part of her project there. See, the privilege of operating a flying machine is great. And that's the actual floating Vimana, which she did outside on a lake in Taiwan. So moving on to another artist, this is Thomas Saraceno. So some of you may have had access to the conversation that I had at UNAM with Thomas last year, the dialogue between us, which has been translated into Spanish. So can I really suggest that if you haven't seen that you have a look at the link. This is his project called Museo Aerosolar, which was done as a way of demonstrating what you could do with waste material around the world. And he basically has now become a collective project, which is being done in various places, but this I think is in Colombia. And Saraceno literally got hundreds of people to put these things together, and then floated them. So just excuse me while I look at my notes on this project. So yeah. This was done also in White Sands, New Mexico, with this project called Aerosolar. And I took part in this as part of a general project with the University of Texas at El Paso, the Rubin Center, in basically an event called Space Without Rockets. And this was the first ever solar-powered balloon done at dawn with the help of the military, actually, in the US, because we couldn't get access to the public part of White Sands. And we can see it flying here. So I'm going to finally show the work. This guy is actually an engineer, not an artist, but I'd like to say he kind of thinks like an artist. It's kind of, I bring this up because it's one of the most spectacular sort of DIY experiments in small scale activism, I think. This man is Naveen Rabelli, and he had this sort of idea that he was basically, he's also based in Bangalore, and this is Project Tehaz. And he was stuck in traffic in Bangalore on the way to a kite festival, and he had a sudden brainwave. He said, why not build a solar powered tuk-tuk and drive it across Asia to London? So here it is on the route. So basically he designed this tuk-tuk to actually literally go all the way from Bangalore to London with solar power. But of course, in the event, there wasn't enough sun, so in some places. So this kind of only increased the social dimension of the project. So in each place, he had to ask villagers for electricity to charge up his vehicle. So in exchange for this fantastical story, he not only got power and a place to sleep in this vehicle, creating a chain of supporters all the way through Iran, Turkey, and Europe. He talks about the ubiquity of the tuk-tuk around India and the rest of the world. He says, well, they're all over India. They're loud and smoky and somehow have some Indianness in them. Everyone has been brought up in one. I think anyone who's been to India or other parts of the world who have these tuk-tuks have always found them great for traveling around because they're very low tech and they're cheap. But obviously, sooner or later, they've got to be electrified, and hopefully this is beginning to happen. So he says everybody's been brought up in one. So he started this process of converting one for his journey. In the 2-year process, he also shared his dream in schools around India. He recalls one father saying that his son had dreamed of owning a Lamborghini. Now he just wants a solar tuk-tuk. So this basic Piaggio Ape model auto rickshaw was converted into a solar-powered zero-emission vehicle with the same specifications as a petrol-driven one, in which Rabelli slept on his 10,000-kilometer journey. You can see the route here. The only way he couldn't drive was obviously through Pakistan because of the visa difficulties for Indians traveling through Pakistan. So he had to go via ship to Iran and then do the rest of the thing. But it shows you in India, Bangalore, Pune, Mumbai, then Iran, Turkey, Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, Austria, Germany, France, and then finally to the UK. And you can see from the interior that his sort of journey, that the place has become like a traveling museum. So in all these villages, he's got kids to draw on the walls, or they've been giving him souvenirs. So this is a picture of him towards the end of his journey in the tuk-tuk that he slept in. So for me, these kind of small-scale initiatives, they're kind of, in this case, an example of a single inventor's dogged persistence. There's thinking like an artist to subvert our expectations about our impossible transport infrastructures and link together ordinary people with a viral thought process that may somehow lead to a step change in thinking about sustainability. An individual's belief, as opposed to institutional belief, based on human interactions, caused the impossible to happen, linking all these families and the kids he met on the way in his journey, taking him all the way from Bangalore to Broadcasting House in London, and leaving behind a trail of memories of the crazy guy in the solar tuk-tuk. So that's it going along. This is just another example of one of the artists, Yoshio Oida, and who's built this homemade coracle, which he cycles around Amsterdam. He's from Japan. And this is the Finnish artist, Antti Leitinen, who made this project called It's My Island, which he rode across the Baltic. And you also see him in this project, It's My Island, in London, actually rather too close to MI6 headquarters, being escorted away by the police. And I visited him in his studio. This is showing another one of his projects. I was on a residency in Finland and made the point of visiting him. And this brings me on to kind of my own interests and projects. So I should explain that I've been a curator now for 35 years. And then before that, I was the editor of a magazine for 12 years called Performance Magazine. But before that, I was a video artist in the 70s, and I used to make half-inch videos. So I've gone back to practice, although I'm still curating and writing. And this is specifically about this light rowing boat, which I have here in the southwest France. It's called a single sculling boat. And I think there's a rowing club in Mexico City. I think I found it once. It's on a lake, but they row boats like this, and they go extremely fast, and they're all very, very unstable. So this is me rowing one, and kind of inspired by thinking about the history of this craft and the development of it. I'm developed a performance which I did in 2018 as part of a residency in Turku, Finland. And it also is part of a larger project which I'm developing with artist Neil White called contingency vehicles. And if you see in the panels, in the panels to the right, we see Buckminster Fuller rowing an invention called the rowing needle. So our idea is to create a contingency vehicle that doesn't have any power, but is rowed by a rower, a little like me, but also a little like the Seft, has radio equipment, has GPS, has mobile Wi-Fi, is equipped with technology, and is potentially able to be rowed into rising water or disaster flood situations. So going back to the performance I did, and here I am doing this performance. As you can see, this is in the river in Turku, Finland, and I've basically got a radio mic, and I'm literally delivering a lecture on the history of rowing, but also on the speed and technology, and also on the fact that some of this technology was stolen from indigenous cultures. So this project was called Close to the Water, and I'm going to ask for the video now to be shown, and you can get a sense of that now. Thank you. Close to the Water was a performance I did on the River Aura in Finland. It was based on my experiences of balancing this single scull boat. I practiced for the performance on the River Tarn near my home in France. As you can see from the way that I'm carrying it, it's a very lightweight boat, which means it can go very fast, but you have to balance it with the oars. It's a bit like flying or being in zero gravity with just those thin oars to balance me. If I make a mistake, I'll capsize. Rowers have their own names for all parts of the rowing action. You can see me doing the catch here, and then I take a stroke, and then I swing, and then I come to the finish, as you see here. It's all enhanced by technology designed to make it go faster. The sliding seat that I'm sitting on is a disputed invention, either happening in the north of England or New York in the middle 19th century. The outriggers, which you can see either side of me, are actually stolen from Pacific Island technology 1,000 years ago. My work in rowing has also inspired a social media group called Wild Rowing, where people can post different images of different types of rowing. But here we have a very interesting picture of Buckminster Fuller, who invented these rowing needles so he could travel from his island in Vancouver to the mainland. And that inspired this Brazilian artist called Guto Lacaz to build
8-oared version of the rowing needles. It's also inspired artist Neil White to work on this collaboration. I'm doing this with him. The Rowed Lab, using Buckminster Fuller's principle of the rowing needles. You can see us testing it here on a lake in Finland. The idea is that it's a contingency vehicle that can take transmission equipment to disaster areas. Here we see the phenomenon of the church boat in Finland. This enormous thing, it's called the Kirkkovinna. It's often seen going up and down the River Ora where I did the performance. For many, though, this was the only way to get to church, the only social contact with villagers for a week. The boats could either also be carrying a corpse in a coffin or on their way to be buried. The outward passage was quiet and sombre, but with perhaps the singing of sacred songs. But on the way back, the church boat atmosphere changes, perhaps reflecting the pagan past. The return trip was an opportunity for locals racing, with men doffing their dark hats and jackets in an atmosphere that was anything but reverential.
It is not known exactly how the church boat evolved, but it must, I think, have been influenced by the Viking longboat in the pre-Christian times when the Norse tribes settled in Finland, sharing a pagan religion with the Finns. Viking is also a verb, and the boats were used to go Viking, i.e. raiding, but it is disputed whether the Finnish tribes also did this. I can't help thinking that the wild row back from church resonated with the rowers' shared pagan heritage with the Vikings, breaking through the Christian church's system of control, throwing off the formal Sunday clothes and racing to the finish.
Now we see 100 years ago the sport of rowing developing, and it would seem like a male sport, but here is Maribel Vinson, also an ice skater in the 50s, joyful on the River Charles in Boston, and she inspired women's rowing as we see it now. This is the Cherpakov Rowing Club in Bulgaria. As you can see, they have a dark sense of humour, breaking the ice to try and take one of these single-scull boats. And this is what, of course, happens in the comedy if you fall in. And humour is quite an interesting part of the culture of rowing. Here we see the apparently aristocratic nature of rowing, the rowing clubs, Oxbridge. But actually, it was a working class sport. People used to row up and down the river for money.
This is the unique cross-border project by Turkish artist Ihsan Banabak and Austrian artist Gerald Hanninger, Rowing for Europe. They rowed this boat all the way up the Danube, passing Serbia, Hungary, Moldova, and ending up in the Black Sea, and then finally Ukraine.
And this is another virtual version of this performance, Close to the Water, which I did in Dundee with the Beau Gamelan Ensemble. That's Anne Bean and Richard Wilson. And after giving a lecture on rowing, they served on these rowing blades a cocktail. And now to the performance itself, Close to the Water on the River Ora in Finland.
To row this light single-scull boat towards you today, and to say something about the resonances between art, rowing, and the history of the water here, and draw some parallels with the themes of this festival. The church boat was in use since the Reformation in the 17th century, and the church made it compulsory to maintain them. For many, this was the only way to get to church. Close to the water.
This is showing the fragility
Butter
of the rower
or eggs.
close to the water, as we need the oars to stop us from falling in. If you let go of the oars, you'll fall in. it may be that
The
civilization
cocks yelled the tempo for the rowers, and the non-rowers swayed themselves, and so eager were they to win that they were aching all over after the race for several days. If a village developed a particularly fast boat, they hid it on their return, so other villages could not emulate it.
I'd like to try and experience the intense nature of the community that this brings. When the sea levels rise, we may all be living on islands and lakes, and we may all need to rely on close communities, as those church boat communities did. This light boat below me is also the symbol of the intense form of capitalism that makes us want to go faster. It's interesting to compare the church boat race's evolution into another watery tradition. Close to the water. Close to the water.
The development of fast light boats for the sport of rowing follows a parallel path with the history of capitalism. For example, the development of faster and faster sailing clippers to beat the opposition to the market. As Paul Virilio said, the invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck.
Close to the water.
It's difficult not to draw parallels here with the practice of classical performance art.
Religion. People who join rowing clubs training in the morning and pushing their bodies and boats to go faster. The modern day Episcopalian rower priest Stacey Grossman takes the religious analogy one step further. Rowers move forward, backwards, which demands absolute trust in the one steering and directing. When we give in to the greater goal, we sometimes feel that we are flying. There are deep spiritual lessons we learn on the water. About leading, about following, about control, about winning and losing, and I try to pay attention to them. Rowing for me is the spiritual and physical practice of the most satisfying order. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oar, trying to get my position.
The body itself becomes a medium of artistic expression, walking on water, stripping away artifice and releasing a collective energy between the artist and the battery of the audience. As Boyce said, even the peeling of the potato can become a work of art if it's a conscious act.
In an act of sensorial empathy, I invite you to imagine yourself embodied in this boat, unbalanced, adapting the words of the festival. I hope of history.
To scull this boat, thinking and not thinking about the way I take a stroke, like this, it's a conscious act. It is a post-art action. The fragility of this position symbolises the fragility of society torn apart by nationalism, fear of immigrants, and in an act of sensorial empathy. I invite you to imagine yourself embodied in this boat, unbalanced, right here in this light boat, on the water.
Away as fast as I can from the Church of New York. Let the boat sing.
This virtual performance was based on material done in collaboration with Turku Rowing Club for New Performance Turku in 2018.
So some final thoughts. This is a photograph I took in London, where I actually was stuck in London during the very first lockdown in the UK lockdown in March 2020, and literally everything ground to a halt. and London saw these clear skies which had never been seen before. And so I think the new challenge for artists is now, so all the work that I've shown you has been done before 2019 or before 2020, early 2020. So now everything is, you know, very remote, and we are thinking about the issue of post-pandemic, when we will be able to travel again, when we will be able to go on holidays again, when we will be able to go back to business or as usual, but will we be able to do that? If basically the Paris Agreement, which says we should stick to 1.5 by 2030 and 0 possibly by 2050, it's just not going to be possible if we go back to the way we were. And so we now really have to think about the way we get around the planet in a way that we probably hadn't really been thinking about when we started up the future of transportation problem. But at the moment, planes are grounded in a lot of places, although they're still now flying. And the question is, how do we take these lessons of these small scale artists' initiatives? I speak particularly because of problems, obviously, in developing countries, because and specifically in countries that are reliant on planes like Latin America. I actually would like to just go back to the CEF project, because of course, while the privatization of the Mexican railways led to the closure of passenger railways, of course, building infrastructure for trains is going to necessarily hopefully replace the flying absolutely everywhere. But at what cost? In the UK, there are many protests against the HS2 project, which is this new fast train that is due to go between London and the north. And there are people, literally activists, digging tunnels to prevent this happening. But also in Mexico, of course, you have the Tren Maya, which is basically, you know, your president as one of your president's projects, of important projects. And I was reading up a bit about it from this lecture, and obviously the destruction of some parts of the rainforest, but also the fact that indigenous people are divided on this. It seems that some people are for it and some people are against it. So even if we replace these infrastructures of air travel and replace them with rail infrastructures, we're going to have to think again about how far we travel. I think it's very interesting that the mayor of Paris has recently proposed this 15-minute zone. So she's had the idea of pedestrianizing the whole of the center of Paris, so that it only takes you 15 minutes to travel either on foot or by bicycle from home to your workplace. And I think having experienced the Sunday bike rides in Mexico City, I'm also very interested to hear about developments for how traffic can be replaced by more sustainable vehicles in Mexico City. And I know in the last session we had as part of this project, we talked a little bit about the Mexican metro and how it could be made more effective. So the final thought is basically, how do we move on from here? How do we move on from the complete slowdown that the pandemic caused to not going back to business as usual? So that's the prime question in the future of transportation. So thank you very much for coming to this lecture. I hope you enjoyed the videos. If you want to find out more about me and my projects, here's the website. And thanks very much to Tanya and Fenella for inviting me to talk to you all today. Goodbye.